Hello and welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast. I'm Joost, your coach over at Pace Buddies. And in this episode, my guest is Scott Johnston, world-renowned coach, founder of Evoke Endurance, and co-author of my favorite book, Training for the Uphill Athlete. In 2025, both the men's and women's UTMB champions, Tom Evans and Ruth Croft, were coached by Scott, which is a remarkable achievement by any measure. In this episode, we dig into the foundations of aerobic base building, or Zone 2, what it is and what it's not, and why it's important to getting that base first before you add any other kinds of training. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Scott Johnston. Hi Scott, and welcome to the Aerobic Edge podcast.
Hey, Joost, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, you too. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. For listeners that doesn't really know you yet, could you explain a little bit how you came into the endurance world, how you became a coach?
Well, I started off coaching cross-country skiing. That was my beginning. I had been a fairly high-level skier myself when I was younger, and then I was living in a place where they needed a ski coach for the junior team, and I put my hand up and said, "Sure, I can do that." And then I very quickly realized, actually, I didn't know anything about coaching. And so I had to do a very quick study program to kind of figure things out. I had been training since I was a child, so I had some sense of it, but I didn't really know the science behind it. And so anyway, I did kind of a very deep dive for a number of years. I coached cross-country skiing up to the World Cup Olympic level for about 15 years. 2014, I had four of my skiers were on the U.S. ski team at the Olympics. And these were kids that I had started with as juniors and brought them along all the way to world-class level. So that was sort of the beginning of my formal understanding and education about coaching and how to apply the theories and the principles that we all learn about when you're studying these things, the physiology and all that. But the application of the theory and the application of the science, I believe, is really, that's the art of coaching. And it's not, we're not machines. And so we can't, we're not going to always get the exact same response to the same input. And I think that's what makes it really more of an art than a science.
Yeah. Training is biology. It's not something you program and it's always the same outcome.
That's right. Yeah.
That's a very good point of view on coaching. It really depends on the athlete as well. Some athletes respond to one training principle and the other one doesn't respond at all.
That's right. Yeah. And then after I had been a lifelong climber myself, mountaineer, climber, and I began coaching a friend of mine who was a climbing partner who went on to become one of the most accomplished alpinists in the world through the height of his career. And at the end of his career, he suggested that we write a book about what we had done for his training. And I thought no one would care. Frankly, I thought that's not why would anybody bother with this? Eventually, he talked me into doing that, and we published our first book, which was called Training for the New Alpinism. And the book was very, very successful. And I was contacted by someone who some people in your audience might know the name of Kilian Jornet, Spanish man who is often called one of the best endurance athletes ever. And Kilian got in contact with me and said, "Hey, I really like what you did." Kilian has a background in exercise science, so he understood the things I was talking about in that book were applicable to other sports. But he said, the problem is your book is about climbing, and people are going to take one look at that cover with these wild, crazy, scary pictures on it and put it down and say, that's not for me. You should write another book like this about training for running. And I said, well, I'd be interested in doing that if you would help me do it. So he and I sat down and wrote the second book, which was called Training for the Uphill Athlete. And it's about training for mountain endurance sports like trail running, mountain running, ski mountaineering, that sort of thing. And then that book kind of launched brought me into a whole new world of, and now I coach some of the better mountain runners in the world.
Yeah, you've coached both winners of the UTMB, for example.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and the book is trail running, but it is also applicable for just road running. The principles discussed about base building and training, and it's applicable for road running as well.
Well, and I think that's something that is the longer I'm in this world, and having started as a child, I now realize, the training for endurance is training for endurance. Yes,
Exactly.
there's technical difference between running and skiing or mountaineering, but, your calf muscles or your quadriceps, they don't know whether you're running a 5-kilometer road race or you're climbing a mountain, all they know is they're contracting and relaxing and contracting and relaxing. They're doing the same thing over and over again. And so when you can understand how to train for endurance, you can train pretty much endurance across a wide spectrum of sports.
Yeah, exactly. Well said. Yeah. And it brings nicely to a next question. We talked about endurance, but what is endurance exactly for an athlete?
Well, it's the ability, I think the technical definition is the ability to sustain a high percentage of your maximum power output for an extended period of time. Now, that's rather vague, but what it does is it means that, for instance, if you're running a 5,000 meter or 5-kilometer race, obviously your sustainable power is going to be higher. You're going to be operating at a higher intensity, but nonetheless, you're operating at your maximum sustainable output. And if you're running a 100-mile race, you're once again running at your maximum sustainable output that you can sustain for 100 miles. So it's the ability to produce power and extend the duration of that power that you can produce, for the percentage of your maximum power that you can produce for a long duration. And so it's really what I think about is, first we have to develop what is the specific speed of the event that you're training for. And obviously that's quite different between 5,000 meters and 170,000 meters. And so what is that speed? And that's the speed we're going to be needing to develop the endurance for. And so it really becomes like, first we have to find the speed. And if you can't, for instance, if you can't run 1 4-minute kilometer, then you have no hope of running 5 4-minute kilometers in a row. So, if your target is to run, a 20-minute 5K, then we have to first get you to the point where you can run that speed. Then we can extend the duration that you can run that speed. I hope that's understandable.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and one big pillar of endurance is your aerobic base, and aerobic is a word we hear a lot, especially with Zone 2 training. Can you explain what the difference is between aerobic and anaerobic?
Sure. For the purposes of an endurance sport, we, all mammals basically have 2 pathways to produce the energy for that sport. And so the first pathway, the aerobic pathway that we're talking about, is aerobic means that it necessarily uses oxygen. That is, we have these 2 metabolic pathways. One uses oxygen and one that does not use oxygen. But these are the things that generate the power that generate the chemical product that allows the muscles to contract. And so it's a little bit like, we're producing the petrol that our muscles need. And that's coming from the food, the breakdown of the food that we eat. And it's almost like we have 2 refining processes, 2 ways of producing this petrol. The first one uses oxygen, the aerobic one, and it can sustain its output for a long, long time, many, many hours. In fact, dozens and dozens of hours, but its output is a little bit slower. And so it's not good at sustaining extremely high intensities. So when extremely high intensity is needed, then we shift to this other refinery, which is the anaerobic metabolic pathway that can take mainly the sugars, the carbohydrates that we eat, in our food and produce the petrol that we need for muscle contraction, but it does not involve the use of oxygen. So these are two distinct. Now, there's other ways that we produce energy, but those are not important to for an endurance athlete. So we just keep it simple with these two pathways. So we have one that is sustainable for many, many hours, but it's rather limited in its output. And we have one that's very high output, but it's unsustainable. And it's unsustainable because it has a metabolic byproduct that makes it self-limiting. And anybody who's ever sprinted up a hill as hard as they can has experienced that limitation. At some point during your uphill sprint of the hill, you will come to a point where that refinery begins to shut down and you'll be forced to slow down. Whereas if you were walking up that hill using the aerobic metabolic pathway, you could walk up that hill for hours at a time. Exactly. So I think it's a good way to think of one is almost unlimited, but in terms of its duration, but it's somewhat limited in the rate it can produce energy. The other one is almost unlimited in the rate it can produce energy, but it's quite limited in the duration that it can produce it.
Yeah, exactly. And the anaerobic system, it uses carbohydrates as fuel, and the aerobic system?
Mm-hmm. It can use anything. It's very versatile. So yeah, it's a little like your diesel car. You can put, McDonald's French fry oil in there and run it. So yeah, the aerobic system is very good at utilizing fat for fuel, but it can also utilize carbohydrates as well. It's more flexible.
Yeah, and it's always a scale. It's never from fat burning switch sugar burning. Absolutely.
Yeah. And even, you and I right now sitting here, and we're not running uphill hard. So we're being, our bodies are being kept alive by this aerobic metabolism. This metabolism takes place in every cell of your body. And so we're being kept alive by this aerobic metabolism, and it's primarily using fat. But if we were able to, we are able to, but if we were to measure our metabolism right now, we would find that we're also burning a little bit of carbohydrate while we sit here and talk.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And for endurance, what we talked about just a few minutes ago, what should be our first priority to train? The aerobic or the anaerobic?
Very much the aerobic. It is the foundation. We sometimes, people maybe have heard the term of aerobic base. When I think of base, I think of that's the base of a pyramid of endurance that we're going to build. And it's the foundation upon which all the other types of training, whether it's strength training or speed or high-end aerobic and anaerobic work, all of those get layered on top of this base. And the bigger the base, the better the results of the things that we layer on top of it. So it's fundamentals for any endurance sport, and by endurance we mean any event that lasts more than about 2 minutes is predominantly going to be the energy for that event is going to be predominantly coming from the aerobic system. And now most people are involved in events that last, considerably longer than 2 minutes. So, and by the time we get out to 2 hours, then it's, at about 2 minutes, it's all about 50-50. About 50% of the energy is coming from the aerobic system and 50% is coming from the anaerobic system. By the time we get out to an hour, it's 90-10. 90% of the energy is coming from the aerobic system. By the time we get to 2 hours, it's 95%. By the time we get to 3 hours, it's 99%. So the aerobic system, as you can see, is the dominant energy production, especially for events that last, a long time.
Yeah. So for the recreational marathon runner, it's all aerobic, basically.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, there will be carbohydrate used during that marathon, for sure. But it's going to be metabolized aerobically rather than in the anaerobic system.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're relying on the anaerobic system to fuel you for a marathon, you're going to have a pretty terrible race.
Yeah, you're on borrowed time.
Yeah, a very short and a very uncomfortable race.
Yeah, exactly. So aerobic training, social media is full of zone 2 training. But what is zone 2 maybe making it, how do you say it? What are you doing wrong with zone 2? Because everyone knows zone 2. There are dozens of calculators on the internet to calculate your zones. Is it that easy?
Well, no, it's not. But the idea is correct. So generally, when we talk about training intensity zones, I mean, there's systems that have 3 zones, and there's systems that have 7 or 9 zones, which is a little crazy. But essentially, the reason these zones are developed is that we have metabolically, this is again, the metabolism is the production of the energy that we need to exercise. We have 2 very distinct metabolic thresholds that occur with us as individuals. The first one, well, we can just call it the first threshold, sometimes referred to as the aerobic threshold. That's as your intensity increases from, let's say, being sedentary to walking to maybe a slow jog to easy running. As you gradually increase the intensity, you will come to a point where, remember, I mentioned that the aerobic metabolic pathway is somewhat limited in the rate at which it can produce energy. And you will come to a point where that you reach the top end of what is often called the aerobic capacity. In other words, the ability of the aerobic system to supply the dominant amount of energy. And it will start to need to employ some of the glycolytic or the anaerobic metabolic pathway. And at that point, that's called this first threshold or the aerobic threshold. And that's an important point. And from that will be the top of zone 2 for every individual. And as we continue to increase the intensity, the anaerobic system begins to play a larger and larger role until we hit a second threshold, which is sometimes called the anaerobic threshold, at which point the aerobic system is pretty much unable to supply the energy, and on almost all of the energy is coming from the anaerobic metabolic pathway. So identifying these 2, and that would be, in many systems, that would be the top of zone 3. But identifying these for you personally as an individual is critical if you're going to use a zone system. And you can't use a percentage of maximum heart rate. You can't, there's some very easy, simple tests that you can do to identify this personally. So don't use a percentage thing, because that's just, if you had 1,000 people, yes, this percentage might be pretty accurate, but you have no idea where you fall in that range. So I recommend people do some very simple tests, which, if you want, we can put a link to. I have an article on our website where it walks you through. The tests are free, they're easy to conduct, and they will help you identify these 2, the top of zone 2 and the top of zone 3, which then anchor your entire zone system. And they personalize it to you, which is vital. You can't train at somebody else's zone 2. You need to train at your zone 2. So the step number 1 is identifying these 2 thresholds for the individual. And then once you have identified those things, then if you want to increase, let's say we're talking about zone 2, we'll forget about the upper zone for a moment. But if we're talking about increasing the ability of this aerobic metabolic system to produce energy, we need to train below it. And this is something that's a little counterintuitive, because we often think that, hey, if I'm not training hard, I'm not getting a training effect, a training benefit. And unfortunately, when we train above especially this first threshold, it pushes the threshold down. It reduces the aerobic capacity of the athlete, because you're telling the aerobic system, hey, you can't produce enough energy, so I'm going to start relying more on this anaerobic system. And so the training stimulus that happens down at the genetic level is, oh, I guess we don't need more aerobic capacity. We actually need more anaerobic capacity. And so that signaling actually changes the expression of genes in the muscle, in the muscle fibers. And you actually lower the threshold. So this is a very difficult concept for many people to come to grips with. Yeah. So those are the main things I think that people misunderstand about zone 2 is first identifying the top of zone 2 for you with this threshold. And then the second is training below it.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's so easy to run too fast. You think I can run faster than this, so I'm going to, but then we're not really training the aerobic system, but training in the gray zone in more the anaerobic system. Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that we see people running very fast for a long time, and we think, we look at the elites, for instance, and we see them running fast and they can do it for a long time. And we think, well, then I need to run fast like that a lot. What we don't realize is that those people's aerobic thresholds, or this top of zone 2 for them, is very fast. So they can run very fast, but they can do it aerobically. And as a very good example of this, the marathon is an event that is competed at or just slightly above a person's aerobic threshold. Now, I think let that sink in for a moment, because that means that Sebastian Sauer's aerobic threshold is better than a 4-minute and 30-second mile pace, which is staggering. Yeah, most of us could not run one lap around the track at that speed.
Absolutely.
But it gives you so even though I was talking about how the aerobic system is somewhat limited in the rate at which it can produce energy, it's still massively powerful. Not everybody who just goes and trains in zone 2 is going to turn into a Sebastian Sauer. That he had a lot of other things going for him besides probably most of his lifetime training. Had some incredible parents and genetics and all that stuff, but it does have phenomenal ability to be improved. And I have seen the aerobic capacity of athletes. I mean, this let's call it the speed at this first threshold, the aerobic threshold. I have seen it increase for 10 years running. And so we have a lot of upside potential to improve our aerobic capacity, but not if we try to shortcut it by training it with a lot of high intensity.
Yeah, exactly. And when you say you see it improve over years and years, does the speed improves, obviously, but does it also change the heart rate at that threshold?
Initially, when people are first starting out, the speed at the threshold and the heart rate will go up in lockstep together. But eventually, the heart rate will plateau, but the speed can continue. So usually, maybe after a couple of years of training, probably not going to see the heart rate at the aerobic threshold increase anymore, but the speed at that threshold will continue to go up.
Exactly, but that is an important thing to notice, because when we calculate our zones with a percentage, your top of zone 2 is set in stone. It's just a percentage of your max heart rate. And if you calculate it with 220 minus your age, well, then you're completely off charts.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Then my max heart rate should be 179 and it's 196. So there's
I think when we're talking about athletes and endurance, we're talking about improving performance. So whatever happens to the heart rate is not as important as the speed. We want to be able to run faster at these different intensities. And if the heart rate goes up for a while at that first threshold, that's great, but that's not really what we care about. What we care about is, are you running faster now than you were, 3 months ago, 6 months ago?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if someone is new to this system of zones, you mentioned the test you can do at home, outside. What is the heart rate drift test? How does it work? Before we continue, if this conversation is resonating with you, chances are you're the kind of runner who wants to train smarter and not harder. That's exactly who I work with at Pace Buddies. I coach recreational runners to achieve their personal best, who are serious about building real aerobic fitness. The kind of fitness that actually shows up on race day. So if you're looking for one-on-one personalized coaching, head over to pacebuddies.com and book a 30-minute free consultation call with me.
Well, we normally ask people, or we try to get people to do this on treadmills. And I'll explain why. And that the reason is that we have more control. So when you're outside, you're going to be dealing potentially with weather and wind, temperature, humidity, all of those things. And so if you let's say you tested one day in November, when it's a very nice, cool day, no wind at all, And then you come and test again in July when it's a hot, humid, windy day. Then you can't compare these two tests anymore. So by doing them on a treadmill indoors, normally you're going to be in a more temperature controlled, humidity controlled environment. But the way this works is we would have an athlete warm up running, and we set the treadmill at 1 or 2% grade. It's not that important, but we're not making it steep. This is especially for road runners. They'll be training mostly on the flats, and have them gradually warm up until they reach a pace that feels, now this is where it gets tricky, and this test often has to be done several times to establish it. But the first time, you're going to go up to a pace that what we would call conversational, the limit of which you could speak in complete sentences, and then hold that speed and let your heart rate stabilize for maybe 3 to 5 minutes. And if the heart rate doesn't continue to rise, okay, that is the speed we're going to do this test at. And then at that point, you push the start button on your watch. And if you're if you're a well-adapted runner, you have a big running history, you're going to run for 1 hour at that speed without touching the speed of the treadmill. And if you're just new to running, it could be 30 minutes or 40 minutes long. And the reason for that is if you're new to running, you're probably going to fatigue more quickly than somebody who has a running history. And so we don't want to make the test too long. So during that, let's say we have this a pretty accomplished runner. During that 1 hour, what we will see at this same speed, the heart rate will gradually drift upward over time. And if the heart rate drifts up less than 5% of the starting heart rate, we would say that you were probably at the aerobic, that starting heart rate was probably very close, and the starting speed were very close to your aerobic threshold. And if it drifts up, 10, 15, 20%, which we often see, then we'd say, okay, you were already above your aerobic threshold when you started this test. And so that means you need to come back, and we'll try the test again at maybe 5 beats slower at the beginning. And eventually you'll find this place where the upward drift will be somewhere in the 2 to 3, 4%. And once you have that identified, now you can go outside and you can say, okay, at 145 heart rate, this was the top of my zone 2. But the reason I like these two tests that we'll put a link to in the article, the reason I like these is they're free and you can do them anytime. And what will happen, most of us have routes that we run regularly. Maybe they're around our neighborhood. Maybe they're on some trail nearby. Well, if one day you've been training and doing this zone 2 training now for 6 weeks, let's say, and one day you notice, that's my normal 1 hour run, but I was 4 minutes faster today than I normally am. Then you would say, okay, the only way that could possibly have happened would be if my aerobic capacity has increased. So now I need to go back and redo that drift test, but I'm going to do it at, let's say, 5 beats higher heart rate beats. And that's why, again, I like this test over going to a laboratory and spending hundreds of dollars on a test, is that when you notice this performance improvement, now go back and you'll be able to reestablish zone 2 has now moved up. You're getting a little closer to the Sebastian Sawe aerobic capacity.
A little bit.
a little tiny bit closer. But that's what I was talking about. That can increase for years and years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I did the heart rate drift test about a month ago, and my heart rate there was 163, and I did for an hour, and the second half was just 3 beats higher than 166. So that would be my top of zone 2, around 163.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
And that would mean, you could get a lot of benefit of effective training to increase your aerobic capacity or that, which means your speed at the second, this first threshold, by training between, like, say, 155 and 163 range, somewhere in that, within about 10 beats. That would be some of the most effective training for you. Yeah. Now, if you're a Sebastian Sawe, the problem with that is it could be very fast. And if that's the case, if it's very fast, there's a good chance you won't be able to do a lot of zone 2 training, because it's, from a neuromuscular standpoint, it's very fatiguing. I mean, you can imagine if your aerobic threshold is 430 mile, that you can't train there very often. Whereas if it's a 12-minute mile or a 10-minute mile, you can probably run that speed almost every day.
Yeah, it's much more demanding on the body. It's still your zone 2, but it's just a big demand on the joints, on your entire body. Yeah, you'll get overtrained. Yeah.
Very much injured or overtrained. So metabolically, you're in the same state. Whether you're, like if I went and ran with Sebastian Sawe when I run it in top of my zone 2, I'm in the same metabolic state as he is. The problem is I'm just going a lot slower. So it's not very neuromuscularly fatiguing. Whereas for him, it's very, he probably does I would guess probably less than 5% of his training in a year is done at marathon pace.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But this is such a personal way to set your zones, and it's much more corrected to your biology, your own body, your metabolic state. Yeah. Very good explanation.
Yeah. Training needs to be individualized to the athlete.
Yeah.
It can't be, one size does not fit all.
Yeah, exactly. And what do you do if an athlete comes to you and you do this test and it turns out that we should walk for our top of our aerobic threshold? What do we do then?
Very common. It's not believe it or not, it's not uncommon at all. In fact, and there's a term for this that some people take offense to because I call it a syndrome. It's aerobic deficiency. It's aerobic deficiency, and it is a syndrome is a set of characteristics or let's say symptoms that display themselves in this state. So when someone cannot run at their first threshold, their aerobic threshold, we would say they are aerobically deficient. They could make massive gains by training in zone 2 and get to the point where they can run. But what we have to do, because every time they start running, their heart rate's just going to zoom right up into a high level. We will do, well, first we can have them walk on an incline treadmill when a person is aerobically deficient, almost any type of aerobic exercise will be beneficial for them. As you become more and more proficient, and if your goal is to be faster at running, then you need to do more and more running. But if you're starting from zero, let's say you're just getting this idea about doing some aerobic exercise into your mind, then it could be on a bicycle, it could be on a rowing machine, or walking on a treadmill, elliptical, anything you can do to elevate your heart rate into that zone will be helpful. But eventually, what we will want to do with them to get them running is we might start them we're going to run for 1 minute. And during that time, maybe your heart rate goes from 110 to 140 in that 1 minute. Well, then we need to let it come back down again. And so we would then walk for 2 minutes, and then we might run for a minute and then walk for 2 minutes. And we can keep this up for many minutes, maybe 30 minutes to an hour even. And eventually what will happen is we will get to the point where we can run for 3 minutes and walk for a minute. And because now our heart rate is rising more slowly and it's recovering faster. And that indicates that there is an aerobic adaptation in the muscle that's going on. And if we do that, eventually they'll get to the point where, okay, now I can run continuously for 15 minutes at a time. So we call this a run-walk progression. But I think in my experience, it's kind of the only way to get somebody who cannot run at all without exceeding their aerobic threshold to the point where, several months later, oh yeah, now we can actually run for 30 minutes at a time.
Yes, exactly. Okay. And do you, you said run for a minute, walk for two, maybe, it's just an example, of course, but you let the heart rate be the decisive factor when to walk.
Right. Yeah. So let's say we decided that your aerobic threshold is 140. And during this minute, your heart rate rises up to 140. Well, then you start walking. And, initially it'll probably take a while for your heart rate to come back down, maybe a couple of minutes. Then when it drops back down to 120 or so, okay, now we start again. We run again. And when it comes up to 140, we start walking again. So it's just this cycle of running and walking and running and walking.
Yeah. And over time, the time that we're running is going to be bigger, and the rest that we need to lower the heart rate is going to be shorter, and eventually we'll be running all together on that heart rate.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the phrase aerobic deficiency syndrome, that's something also that from Dr. Phil Maffetone, I believe.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So would MEF training be an option for fixing the aerobic system?
Yes, it is. Essentially, that's what maximum aerobic function is, the MAF training method. And I've known Phil since 1983. So he and I go way back. I went to see him as an athlete once, and when he first explained this concept of aerobic deficiency, somewhere in my mess here in my office, I have a brochure that he gave me in 1983. So he's been at this longer than I have. But so yes, the method he developed called MAF training, which is it's a formula, which is one disagreement I have with him on it. Basically, you take 180, you subtract your age, and then that's the top. At that time there were no zones because there were no portable heart rate monitors. We didn't really have heart rate zones at that time, but he determined. And it's a very conservative estimate, but basically by taking a person's age, subtracting it from 180, that gave you the upper range of heart rate that you should train at in order to improve this maximum aerobic function. And it's pretty darn good. I mean, it's not, I would prefer the tests that we do now because they are more individualized. But if a person had, didn't want to do the test or whatever, they'll be pretty darn close if they just take, use the MAF formula. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe when we start out as a beginner, maybe run walking, and then we want to build towards continuously walking, then it could be a safe way, and then do the heart rate drift test.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's not as, like I said, not as individualized. That's its only drawback. But the theory and the principle that he's using that he came up with that idea from is a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So now we're at a base. We're training. That could be a block of several months, I think, to achieve a bigger aerobic base.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and how do we progress from there? When do we add intensity, or what's your thoughts on that?
Well, even during the aerobic base phase, let's say someone, whether you're aerobically deficient or not, during this period when we're trying to, well, no, I shouldn't say that. Let's just talk about someone who's aerobically deficient. But during this period where your primary goal is to increase your aerobic capacity, increase the speed at that first threshold, you can also be doing some intensity, but it needs to be short and it needs to be fast. And so what we do during that time, we'll introduce things like strides. That may be a term that many people are familiar with, these are not full sprints, but so maybe you're out for an easy run and you accelerate up to something that feels fun and fast, like, maybe a 5-kilometer run pace. And you hold it for anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds and then slow back down, run easily for a few minutes and do it again. So adding strides will begin to build power in your legs. It also helps your form, because running very slowly is a different running technique and form than running at faster speeds. And then the other thing we add are what we call hill sprints. And these are done at nearly maximum sprinting, so 90% effort. They're going to be very short, between 10 and 15 seconds long, and on a gradient of, around 15 to 20% grade. And these also help develop power in the legs. And these can be done concurrently with this big volume of aerobic-based training, the easy zone 2 training. And it will help increase your running economy. The reason we use the hills to sprint on and not the flats is it's very easy to injure yourself sprinting on flat ground. I mean, look at even people who are well-conditioned sprinters often have hamstring problems and Achilles tendon problems. And if you're not well conditioned as a sprinter, it's very dangerous to sprint on the flat ground. But by sprinting up a steeper hill, we eliminate some of the impact. We eliminate the body mechanics change slightly, and there's much less chance of injury. Still can happen, but it's much less chance. And so during this aerobic base period, we always have those two workouts, one of each week. And then we also are doing usually strength training during that time. And many runners shy away from strength training, but it's, I think, a mistake. And people need to be doing strength training for, especially if as they age. So that would be the way we'd handle it there wouldn't be, during this, let's say, calling it this period where we're trying to fix the aerobic deficiency, there won't be any traditional, let's say, high intensity interval training.
No, exactly.
Just these shorter high intensity things I just mentioned. Whereas a person who's already well conditioned aerobically, they're going to be doing some high intensity interval training even during this base phase, because as your aerobic capacity increases, it gets harder and harder to increase it more. So let's say your aerobic threshold running pace is a 430 kilometer. Well, to move it from a 430 kilometer to a 420 kilometer is going to be a lot slower and harder than it was to move it from a 5-minute kilometer to a 430 kilometer. So as we get faster and better aerobically, the gains come slower and slower, but they'll continue to come. So this person is also probably actively training for a race, and they will need to, even the aerobically deficient person, let's go back and have to recorrect what I was just saying. If you came to me and you were aerobically deficient and you said, yeah, but I've got a 10K I'm training for in 2 months, I'd say, okay, well, regardless of the fact that your aerobic capacity is low, we still need to introduce some training that is done at or slightly faster than the pace you hope to run in the race. And, this isn't far from ideal, but it's what we need to do. Everybody needs some high intensity training who's going to go into a competitive event. But for the person who's well conditioned aerobically, that could take place over several months. Months and months of training mixed in with their zone 2 training.
Yeah, exactly. And for zone 2 training or your aerobic training, it's mostly a volume to nudge the base up. You said in your book and in the other podcast, you can't pull it up from above, but you can only push it up from under it.
Yeah. And the biggest stimulus to increasing that zone 2, the aerobic threshold, is volume.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason that, high level endurance athletes train a huge volume of low intensity. You think about a good marathon runner, they're going to be running at least 100 miles a week. And you can't run 100 miles at high intensity. Those are 100 miles done, fairly easily. And it's because that's what stimulates this aerobic base, is not the intensity.
And then the second threshold, the lactate threshold, do you also always work below it or also above it?
That's a bit of my experience has been to work below it primarily, but I know there are people who differ with that. But the reason I believe it's important to work below it is, once again, it's the duration of time you can spend at this intensity. It's going to have the biggest stimulus. And if let's say we have this threshold, this second threshold. If we are training 5 beats below it or 2 beats above it, the difference on the fatigue on the body is massive. So training 5 beats below that threshold, we can handle 5 times the volume if we were to train slightly above that threshold. And my experience has been, while there is some benefit, there is a benefit to training above it. You only need a small amount of that training above it. But the global fatigue that comes with training above that second threshold is, well, I'll give you an example. Working with, one of the people that I coached that won the Ultra Trail de Mont Blanc last year, he will do typically in the range of 3 hours at this second threshold, just below the second threshold in a week. If he were to train above that second threshold, he might be able to handle 30 minutes in a week because the fatigue is so great. So, and in his case, of course, he's racing 100-mile distances, so the need for the higher intensity isn't as great. But even if you're training for moderate and distant duration, 5,000 meters, 10,000, half marathon, I still find that the benefits of training a little below it far outweigh the gains you can make by training above that threshold.
Yeah, that makes sense, because for every stimulus we give our body in training, it has to recover, and how higher the intensity, how longer we have to recover, so we can't run. So if the intensity is a little lower and recover faster, we can do more in training.
Exactly. Yeah, it's definitely, and it's an exponential change. It really, once you step over that threshold, the stress on the body goes through the roof.
Yeah. Okay. And we mentioned that lactate and that second threshold. You have a perfect analogy in your book about lactate, because a lot of runners think as lactate as a waste product, as something that fatigues, but lactate can also be used as a fuel. How does that work between our aerobic and the lactate threshold?
Well, when we metabolize carbohydrate through the anaerobic process, it partially breaks down. So we're metabolizing glucose, which is a form of sugar, and partially broken down glucose, when it produces this energy that we've talked about needed for muscle contraction. But there's a byproduct that is another form of sugar called lactate. It's just another sugar type of molecule. And so what it tells you is that the metabolism of the glucose was not complete. You have this other molecule called lactate, which is again a form of sugar, which is sitting there unused. So it's like this is a fuel that your body hasn't used yet. If we can take that lactate and move it into a muscle cell that can use it for fuel, as opposed to just letting it accumulate as a waste product, we'll get a lot of benefits out of that. In fact, one of the principal researchers on what's called the lactate shuttle, which is the ability of the muscles to move lactate from where it's being produced to someplace else where it can be used effectively. That was a guy named George Brooks, who in early 80s identified this lactate shuttle. And Brooks has said that he believes that in the aerobic metabolism, that lactate is actually the preferred fuel over glucose. So if you give the muscle a choice to burn glucose or lactate, it will choose lactate. And it's partly because the lactate's already partially broken down form of sugar. So the higher the intensity or the faster we run, the more of this lactate we're producing. And if this is the whole point of this aerobic base, now we're getting into the physiology, so people have to, bear with me for just a minute. I'm not going to get down in the weeds too much with this. But we have the lactate that is being produced by the muscles that are allowing you to run fast. And if the lactate accumulates, that is a signal of fatigue. We don't fully understand. The lactate itself isn't what's causing the fatigue, but we know that when lactate accumulates, that there is fatigue related with it. And if we can keep the lactate levels low, then we can postpone the fatigue. So if we can shuttle that lactate from the muscle fibers where it's being produced, that are the ones that are allowing you to run really fast, and move it over to these other muscle fibers that have more aerobic capacity, they will take that lactate and use it for fuel. And that will delay the onset of fatigue. And those are the zone 2 fibers. These fibers that we train when we're running in zone 2, those are the ones that are going to be taking this lactate and doing something useful with it rather than just having it sit around or accumulate. So we don't need to measure the lactate, although it's a very easy process now, and the portable lactate meters are not even very expensive anymore. But people don't need to go to that level. They just need to understand that this is actually the reason for zone 2 training that very few people talk about. Is it's increasing the reservoir of muscle fiber that can take up and use this lactate to keep it from accumulating and slowing you down.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, in your book you named a vacuum cleaner. How bigger your vacuum cleaner, the more lactate you can pull in and use again for energy.
And so we can think of the vacuum cleaner, that is the aerobic capacity. That is those zone 2 muscle fibers. And a person who, like Sebastian Sawe, he's got a phenomenal vacuum cleaner. He's got a huge one.
Yeah, it's a hurricane cleaner.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's not one of those little things you use in your car. No.
No, exactly. Yeah, so that's also aerobic building again, to raise that capacity and get our heart rate as close as possible to our lactate threshold, so we can shuttle it all back again. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And we mentioned aerobic deficiency. When are we no longer aerobically deficient?
Mm-hmm. As a rule of thumb, I like to use when the spread between these two thresholds we've been talking about is less than 10%. And that could be measured 10% speed-wise or 10% heart rate. So let's say someone has a first threshold, this aerobic threshold of 150. That would mean that the second threshold needs to be around 165. And when that happens, we would say they're no longer aerobically deficient.
Yeah, sure. And when they're not no longer aerobically deficient, then that's the period of time we can introduce more speed training. And always under the lactate threshold or also above?
So yes, when the spread is below 10%, we call them, they're no longer aerobically deficient, and they will definitely be in a place where they're going to benefit more from doing more high intensity training. Now, once again, I would still have most of that high intensity, almost all that high intensity training is going to be done just below that second threshold or somewhere between these two thresholds, and a tiny bit will be above it. But yes, they will get, now they have a big enough vacuum cleaner that they can handle that higher intensity training.
Yeah, exactly. Because something we hear a lot of as coaches, of course, is that someone wants to be quicker, so they want to train faster. But in reality, mostly the vacuum cleaner isn't big enough to handle it. So we have to build that aerobic base first.
Yeah, and I like to think of what my goal as a coach for an endurance athlete is. I want them to be as fast as possible, as aerobically as possible. And if we can do that, we've succeeded as coaches for our athletes. And if if the only way they can run fast is to go above that second threshold, then, as I said in the beginning, they're going to have a very short and very uncomfortable race because you can't sustain. No one, it doesn't matter how mentally tough you are, no one can sustain that intensity for more than just a few minutes. Once you get above that second threshold, you are living on borrowed time. And you're going to have to slow down to allow the vacuum cleaner to catch up at some point. And so for someone like Sebastian Sawe, I know we keep using him, but it's such a striking example. It's hard not to use him. His two thresholds are very, very close together, and they're very high in terms of both speed and heart rate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Sebastian Sawe is the new Kipchoge, I think. We're going to hear his name a lot more.
I never thought we would stop talking about Kipchoge, but here we are.
Yeah, exactly. For someone that wants to build their aerobic base and want to become faster aerobically, what do you typically see as a time period? A lot of plans are 12, 14 weeks plans, but this takes more
months. Yeah. So it would depend on, it depends on a number of things. Age is a huge component. Genetics. Some people will respond faster to aerobic training than others. I've never seen someone not respond, but unfortunately, not unfortunately, you can't do anything about age or genetics. So we can forget that, but they are going to, like, if you were, 16 and doing this, you will respond much faster than when you're 46. With the same genetics. But what I have seen, but the main thing we have control over, excuse me for mixing up my words there, the main thing we have control over is the duration. As I said earlier, the volume of this type of training is the most important stimulus. So someone who's maybe can fit in 2 or 3 hours of running in a week is going to progress a lot, given the same age, same genetics, they're going to progress a lot slower than somebody who can put in 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a week. And so that's on the individual basis. So what I have seen, though, is I could take someone who is aerobically deficient. Maybe their aerobic threshold running pace is 8 or 9 minutes per kilometer, and if they can train, if they can run and do other aerobic training, because remember, they're aerobically deficient and they probably are not good runners yet. If they can train consistently and get in 6 or 7 hours a week of aerobic training, we'll often see that, a 9 minute per kilometer pace drop to an 8 minute per kilometer pace in just a few months. But it's not magic. It just takes time. And this is one of the things, I'm sure you fight this as a coach. There's so much misinformation out on the internet about do this workout. It's the secret. It's magic, and you'll improve your VO2 max in 6 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever it is. Yeah. I mean, it's all crazy. If that stuff worked, then that's the way the top athletes would train, and they don't train that way.
Yeah. This workout made me run a sub-3 marathon. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation. And it's, one of the reasons I started this podcast is to share this kind of knowledge to everyone, to beginners, to recreationals, so we can build a better base and stay healthy as a runner, because that information just leads to overtraining or injuries or other problems.
Absolutely. And it sets false expectations. So people will do that training thinking, well, I saw this on the internet and I watched a 30-second Instagram clip and it told me to do this, and then it doesn't work. And or the worst case, I think the worst thing is that running is a very injury inducing sport. And most people who are getting into running will become injured within a few weeks or a few months. And it's often because they're ramping up both the volume and or the intensity at too fast a rate. And it's almost always connective tissue injuries. Achilles tendonitis, patellar tendonitis, you name it. But it's not the muscles themselves. It's usually the connective tissue. And it's because those connective tissues are so poorly vascularized. They don't get much blood. They adapt very slowly. Whereas the muscles they get a lot of blood and they adapt very quickly. So your muscle will become fitter, but then those tendons aren't becoming fit and strong enough. And so people will say, wow, I feel much fitter today than I was a week ago. And so they run a little faster and boom, there goes their Achilles tendon because it's not ready for that kind of load. So I think not setting unrealistic expectations is very important for people to keep them from being injured, because it's consistency over the long term that's going to really make the big difference for people. Not some magic secret workout that they are doing. Yeah.
No, exactly. And it's a good point what you said, your muscles adapt much quicker. Wasn't tendons and joints more like 7 times longer than muscle fibers too?
They're about 1/7 as well vascularized as muscle. So they adapt at about 1/7 the rate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something to really keep in mind, so we don't ramp up too much too soon, because our muscles maybe can take it, but our joints can't.
Yes, right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to be respectful of your time. We're already talking for an hour, and I feel I can talk with you for another few hours. Is there something we've missed? Is there something we can take away for the recreational marathon runner? What they can do to implement this into their training?
Well, I think we've explained, I think, pretty well how to implement this into their training. But I'll go back to reinforce a couple of things here. That consistency is the key. I mean, it's getting out there frequently. If you're inconsistent, then your body will get this. Let's say you run on a Tuesday, your body gets a signal to go, whoa, I need to improve, whether it's my aerobic capacity or the stiffness of these tendons or whatever it is. And then you don't do anything for 8 days. Well, that stimulus that your body got, the message that was sent to it, has worn off then, and your body's going to go back to its normal state. And then you come back 8 days later and you have to do it again. It's like, so randomly and infrequently applying these training stimuli is not effective at all. And what is effective is giving that signal frequently to the body, like, hey, you need to get better at this. And it's a slow process, which is not very YouTube friendly. It's not sexy. It's not exciting. It's just, hey, you got to get out there and do this every day, or as close to every day as you can. And it's that, I think that's one of the reasons people get drawn to these exciting looking training fads and things is that, well, that looks fun and exciting. I mean, it probably is fun and exciting, but is it something you can do every single day? And it's really the frequency and the being continuous with this, consistent with it, that I believe is the key. And so for me, I think that the type of athletes that are drawn to endurance sports are very different than are drawn to the speed and power sports. So the type of athlete that's drawn to endurance sports, typically, the way they love the process, they have to embrace the process of training and saying, I like being out there every day going for this run. And it's that process, because if you're only fixated on the goal, breaking 40 minutes for a 10K, if that's your fixation, then that's only going to come every now and then. Whereas if you are embracing the process, if it feels good to be out there doing this every day, then you're likely to continue it, and then the 40-minute 10K will happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very good point. Consistency is key. Yeah. And
unfortunately, we live in an age of instant gratification, whether it's the internet has just done that to us. And so we see these people doing these amazing things, and I want to do that amazing thing too. So I'm just going to jump right in it and try that amazing thing. And it's like, no, that person that's doing that amazing thing has been training like that for 15 years. And so, it didn't happen overnight.
Yeah. You want to run a sub 40 10K, so you download a training plan and you think, well, I can do this.
Just start. So I'm just going to go out there and run 4-minute kilometers every time I run. Yeah. And then, a week later, you're going to be hurt.
Yeah, exactly. And we're surprised.
And people are, what happened? What could possibly have gone wrong with that?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Scott, I want to thank you very much for coming on the podcast. You explained very, very well why it's so important to work at our aerobic base first before we try to increase our speed workouts, that we have to work at our base first. So there are a lot of questions left, like muscular endurance and VO2 max, but that's a whole other podcast in itself.
We'll have to do another one later. Yeah,
exactly.
Talk about those things.
Yeah.
But I think covering this is the best place to start. People need to understand this, because these other things, whether it's muscular endurance or more traditional interval training, VO2 max, all those things, they have a place, and it's important to understand them. But if you don't get this base stuff figured out, then none of that other stuff matters.
Exactly. As you mentioned, it's like the base of a pyramid. If you have a really big base, you can get a really high pyramid. If you're just going after the tip of the pyramid, your base is going to be this small.
Exactly.
You're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So Scott, where can people find you as a coach? Yeah.
Endurance.com. That is the website for my business, and we train a lot of different kinds of endurance athletes on that website. Have 19 other coaches that work with me, so we're quite busy.
Very good. Good to hear.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming to the podcast. I'll link to Evoke and to the articles you mentioned in the show notes, so people can look them up and see what the heart rate drift test is and see your methods. Thank you very much for coming here.
All right. Thanks, Joost. Okay. Nice to talk to you. Bye-bye.
That's a wrap for today's episode, and thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the Aerobic Ed podcast, the best thing you can do is leave a review at Spotify or Apple Podcast. It just takes a few minutes and helps other runners to find the show. And if you want to take your training to the next level, come and talk to me. I work with recreational runners who want a structured, evidence-based approach to building real aerobic fitness. The first call is free. You'll find the link in the show notes or over at pacebodies.com. Thank you for listening and see you in the next one.